the habitual historic persecution of the Jewish people, it goes beyond anything that's remotely connected to normal human experience. I'm Dr. Andrew Shatte. I'm a PhD psychologist, and I've spent my life and my career following my passion, which is to understand the concept of resilience in the broadest possible way, and to help people from kids who are 0 to everyone throughout the lifespan to become more resilient. I've sort of made it a personal mission to make 8 billion plus people more resilient on this planet.
So my name is Pinchas Taylor. I'm a Chabad rabbi down in South Florida, and I'm really happy and excited to be here with you today. So your big thing is resilience. How would you define resilience?
It's a great question, and it's a question that plagued the field for many, many years. I started getting interested in the concept of resilience back in 1985, and I sort of toyed with it part-time. But in 1992, I started to get really serious about it, and I developed with colleagues a bunch of resilience programs. We knew that we were boosting resilience, but we had to admit that we didn't really know what resilience was. And we'd go out to the field. We were graduate students. We'd go out to the field and say, what do you think resilience is? And they'd say, it's overcoming adversity and steering through problems and moving through trauma. And we knew that that was a big part of resilience, but that's not what resilience is. That's what resilient people do. So we started to really try to understand the factors that make up resilience. We've determined that there are 7 principal factors: the capacity to control your emotions under pressure, the capacity to control your impulse to behave in ways that may be counterproductive when you're under pressure, the ability to do good problem solving, to look at all the causes of a problem and determine what you can control and what you cannot. We know that self-efficacy, that sense of mastery in the world, hard-earned, is an important piece of the puzzle. We know that optimism, realistic optimism, is very important. We know that empathy is key because people use their empathy to form social support, which they use when times are tough. And then finally, having that growth mindset, the capacity to reach out to opportunities and challenges. And so we did a lot of experimental work around this in the late 1990s, and we published our book, The Resilience Factor, in 2002, which talked about these 7 factors and how we can go about boosting each one of them. And I think that was one of my biggest contributions to the field, if I've had any, which was that we were really getting a competency model around resilience. Before then, it was kind of squishy, amorphous, difficult to get your arms around. But now we had 7 concrete things that we could measure and we could boost.
Would you say that there is a type of person that is more likely to be a resilient person?
Certainly not from birth. There's very little evidence to suggest that there's anything to do with nature around resilience. We do know that by the time someone is 7, 8, 9, 10, we're going to start to see whether or not they're resilient or not. We can measure them around about that time in terms of their resilience. But what we know happens is that people develop styles of thinking about themselves and their world and their place in the world. We know that
at about 10 years old?
Yes, by the time they're about 8 to 12, it's developing. By the time they're 12, it's a pretty strong habit, which is why we refer to it as a thinking style. And by the time they're 18, 19, 20, the research shows it's largely set in stone. And the perceptions they have about themselves and the causes of their problems, and also their views of the future and themselves and how the world should be, these are things that are learned throughout the lifespan. But by the time we are 8 to 12, we've got some pretty strong habits. And how we think about those things, the thinking styles we develop, are the biggest determinant of whether we're going to be resilient or not.
Well, one of the things I've read about cultivating resiliency is that in order for someone to gain a sense of resiliency, they need to connect with something higher or outside of themselves. And I believe that's something that you've discussed as well. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. We do know that this reaching out, taking on opportunities and challenges and getting bigger than oneself is an important piece of the puzzle. I often think about this in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I think that if you can get everything else in place, then you're in a position where you can start to turn your mind to something that's more universal. But just because it might be more of a luxury item when it comes to resilience doesn't mean that it's not absolutely essential. And the most resilient people I've ever met, and I've spent 31 years in this business meeting some of the most resilient people in the world, they all have some sense of meaning, mission, and purpose, a connection to something deeper and larger, a faith, a religious belief, a set of values, that guide them day in and day out and just make them stronger people.
How do you think that the role of faith or spirituality, something higher, something outside of yourself, how do you think that that actually cultivates resilience?
I think it does in a couple of ways. And, it's really interesting because we live in a very secular society. And I do a lot of work in the Fortune 1000.
Okay.
And, when you're training within the Fortune 1000, they expect you to be secular. But I came to a point where I felt as a social scientist, it was actually my duty to go to people and say, hey, guess what? If you want to take the next step in resilience, you need to think about these data that we're gathering because they are incontrovertible. And we're looking at 4 levels of connection to stuff larger than yourself. Some people are just obsessed with their individual goals, the big corner office, making money.
Sure.
Others will do that, but they also think about their family, a nuclear family, extended family. And then there's a 3rd level where people take care of that, but they're also very invested in their community. But there's a 4th level where people are really getting outside of themselves, and that's going to be a religious faith or a spirituality or a value system. And what we found was that for each step up across those 4 levels, people were significantly more resilient. So in 2010, when I was asked to do a TED Talk, I said to the TED people, I'm going to talk about the importance of spirituality, faith, in terms of resilience. And they said, no, we don't want you to do that. And I said, well, I think I need to, because these data now are unquestionable.
Right.
And so what I found was that the Fortune 1000 were, for me, surprisingly receptive of this message. And I think that the way that, to answer your question, that it plays out is I conceptualize it like this. If you're at that lowest level where only your individual goals are important to you, then your world is extremely small. And that means when an adversity comes up in your world, it's a major obstacle, a huge mountain, right? But if your world is your community, less so. And if your world is something that has a piece of eternity to it, and I think that's the litmus test. It can be spirituality in the broadest sense. For many people, it is a religious faith. But it's something that was here before they arrived on the planet and will be here after they've gone, and they're attaching to it while they're here. And that gives them a breadth of perspective and existence that means that even the greatest obstacle is really just a speed bump. And so I think that is the way, that's one of the ways in which it actually plays out in a person's life and makes them more resilient. Plus, they're galvanized to act. They wake up every morning with a sense of purpose.
Right. Right. I imagine that purpose would play a huge role in a person's resiliency because you can withstand any sort of what if you have your why that's attached. That's the cliche. It's becoming cliche now to say that, but that it helps you keep everything in perspective.
Yes. And, we should never allow Viktor Frankl to become cliched.
Right.
And that comes from Viktor Frankl, of course. And, it's just groundbreaking stuff. The work that he did was so important. We, as psychologists, I think, became so bound up in social science that we left behind some of these really important early messages that our colleagues were saying. And I think that was a loss. I feel like it's being recaptured. And I do believe that it is, For people, it's often religious faith, but it's not always. For some people, it's a love of country. I do a lot of work with the military, and I see them wake up every morning. They want to protect the 350 million citizens of the U.S. That's their passion.
That's bigger than themselves.
Yes, and it is larger than themselves.
So interesting. And it's kind of interesting also that depending on what environment you find yourself in, you're oftentimes saying the same thing, but with different words. So when you go to the Fortune 1000 companies, if you say religion, right, or faith, it's like, whoa. But if you say resiliency and connecting with something bigger than yourself, it's like, oh, well, we'll welcome that. Meanwhile, you're saying essentially the same thing. It's like on the street, you call it vibes. On, in more mystical or new age talk, you call it energy. But we're all kind of saying a similar thing of that there's something deeper, there's something bigger to reality than just the surface level.
Absolutely so. And, I would say that 90% of the resilience skills that I'm taking into organizational settings are really not about spirituality or religion. They're about day-to-day, how do we quiet the mind, control our impulses, do better problem solving. But if we neglect that critical 10%, then we're not doing people a service. And I will, if I'm training or consulting, I will say to people, these are the data, and we've been collecting them since 2006. And the data clearly say that with each step up in the circle of connection that you have to something greater than self, you will be more resilient. Now, I'm not telling you that you need to get faith. This isn't a tent revival meeting.
Right.
But what I am saying is that you want to connect to something larger than self to the degree that you are comfortable. And because it's very clear that it's going to matter in terms of your personal resilience. It's
so interesting because the way that people tend to think about spirituality is that it's something removed from the world. Where I always thought one of the things I always found fascinating about traditional Judaism was this idea that spirituality is defined as exactly what you're talking about, refining oneself and figuring out how to cope with the struggles and the idiosyncrasies that we may have, how to be a resilient. That is spiritual. It's implementing within yourself a change of your negative character traits, the things that are holding you back. That is the spirituality. It's not leaving the world. It's actually transforming the self. And so it's kind of interesting that we maybe have a tendency to run from spirituality, from the word religion, but meanwhile, in traditional Judaism anyway, religion or spirituality is this very thing, is transforming the self and transforming the world. It's two sides of the same thing.
I really love that interpretation, and I think it's really important that we keep that in mind. That this isn't something that we do on a Saturday or a Sunday.
Right.
It should be something that is part of our everyday. And you're mentioning that leads me to think about some of the examples that I see just in people's everyday movement through the world. So someone who is not resilient, as they're moving through the world and they encounter a problem, their instinct is to say, why me? This is disastrous. I don't deserve this. Whereas someone who is resilient has that greater perspective even on these day-to-day adversities. And they will in fact say, why not me?
Right. Or what can this teach me?
Or exactly. Yeah. How can I learn from this? Or, you can see they almost get a sparkle in their eye when they hit up against the adversity and they're thinking, well, this will be an interesting one to try to solve. And this is a great challenge that's been sent my way. How am I going to deal with this? Or what strengths do I have that I can bring to bear here that can make the situation better, not just for me, but for others? So, and that does get to your point, that this is a day in, day out thing.
So in Jewish history, there's been a lot of resilience, mostly because of a lot of trauma and persecution and all sorts of negative stuff. Have you seen a correlation between resiliency and people having trauma in their life? Or how would you say that trauma actually maybe even helps a person be a more resilient person?
I'm not an expert or not even an amateur expert, not even remotely knowledgeable, except what most people know about what the Jewish people have been through historically. It's certainly nothing that I personally have lived. I know the numbers, and it's inconceivable. It's absolutely inconceivable. But if you force me to make some suppositions as to why a people could get through the things that the Jewish people have been through, I would say it's faith in something larger than self. I would say it's a strong sense of belonging. And I've got to say, we're here at the National Jewish Retreat, and I'm not Jewish, but you feel that sense of belonging. And it's a wonderful feeling that we are in this together. I think that, you could probably recount this same kind of thing outside of the Jewish faith for what people have endured and gone through. I think that sense of belonging and sticking together and not allowing this to fragment us, but instead we're actually going to bond closer together because of all of these things that have happened to us. I think that's been a critical piece of the puzzle, and all of that gets to this sense of resilience.
The Rohr Jewish Learning Institute has the largest collection of Jewish media online. Hit subscribe for more.